Steve Greenhouse. I'm moderator today. Today we have four first-rate journalists discussing their coverage of work in the workplace during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're fortunate to have four journalists who have been on the front lines, covering workers on the front lines. Josh Eidelson covers labor for Bloomberg News and Business Week. Josh previously wrote for Salon and The Nation and wrote one of the first major pieces analyzing the worker backlash and protests after COVID-19 arrived. Lauren Gurley covers labor and technology for Vice News and Motherboard. Lauren used to work for the New Republic and has written several exclusives about the strikes planned at Amazon, Whole Foods, and elsewhere. Noam Scheiber covers workers in the workplace for the New York Times. He previously worked at the New Republic for 15 years. Noam recently did an excellent story on how OSHA is letting non-healthcare employers regulate themselves on COVID-19 matters and essentially letting essential workers fend for themselves. Nitasha Tiku is a tech reporter for the Washington Post who often writes about workplace issues. Nitasha used to work for Wired and BuzzFeed News. She's written about numerous COVID-19 related strikes and about how Silicon Valley's contract workers have been treated considerably worse than regular workers as the coronavirus has spread. Ground rules. Each speaker is to talk for around 4 minutes to start, and then we will take questions. This session is being recorded, and assume everything you say will be on the record. Everyone watching this webinar can click on the participant icon, which will give you the full set of participants and the option to raise your hand to be called on for questions or comment. Everyone can also post comments and questions in the chat area, and I might use them to pose questions to the panelists. I want to thank Emily Smith and Joel Gershenfeld for holding my hand and helping me host this. After the four speakers complete their remarks, this will be an open forum, although the speakers can comment upon each other's remarks. People can pose questions and comments, try to keep it to no more than 60 or 90 seconds. With 5 minutes left in this hour-long session, I will invite each of the speakers to speak for a minute to conclude. I often hear people complain about the lack of labor reporters and labor coverage. I often tell those complainers that you don't realize how much good labor coverage and how many good labor reporters there are. In addition to these four top-notch reporters with us today, there's Dave Jameson at Huffington Post, Margot Roosevelt at the LA Times, Hamilton Nolan at India's Times, Alexa Campbell-Fernandez at the Center for Public Integrity, Claire Kane-Miller at the New York Times, L.M. Sixel at the Houston Chronicle, Eli Rosenberg at the Washington Post, Mike Grabell at ProPublica, Rachel Cohn at The Intercept, as well as Sarah Jaffe, Michelle Chen, Mike Elk, Michael Sonato, and numerous others I don't have time to mention. Plus, Labor Notes does excellent work. I've often felt that many news organizations don't focus nearly enough on the nation's low-wage workers, while they focus perhaps too much on tech workers and gig workers. Those are sexy areas favored by editors. But I've seen a sea change in coverage since this horrible pandemic hit. There's been so much outstanding reporting about the trials and travails of grocery workers, meatpacking workers, hospital and nursing home workers, delivery workers, warehouse workers, transit workers. With millions of essential workers facing so many dangers on the job during this pandemic, it's been great to see my fellow journalists make so many of these often invisible workers suddenly hugely visible, and to shine a light on the dangers that so many of them face on the job. So now the four top-notch journalists will have the floor, and we'll start with Josh Eidelson.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to our fellow terrific panelists, and to Wilma, Emily, Bill, Joel, and everyone at Lyra for making this conversation happen. Thanks also to everyone joining us, and I'd love for you to get in touch with me about these issues or about opportunities to break news. We're talking at a moment of unusual urgency and demand for labor journalism, where the pandemic has made it more acutely clear how central work is to everything that we as a society are grappling with, both having work and not having work. It's also a moment that comes with some particular challenges. One of those challenges is how we reconcile the restrictions the pandemic is imposing on us reporters, from limitations on movement to new family responsibilities, with key aspects of our work, like finding sources, building relationships, fact-checking, and describing what it's like to be someplace that we ourselves are not able to go to. A second challenge is choosing and executing stories in an environment where, even more than usual, a ton is happening and things are changing very quickly. So the news is a moving target. I know my colleagues at Bloomberg and elsewhere on all sorts of beats all the time now are coming across news that if it had just happened a week earlier, would have felt like a major story, but now doesn't because too many other things kind of like that thing have happened, seemingly out of nowhere in some cases, over the past several days already. A third challenge, especially at a moment where many people, not Lyra folks necessarily, but many people are newly focused on what's happening in workplaces, is placing what we're seeing in context and distinguishing what's wholly new from what's just been turbocharged by the pandemic. Many of the phenomena we're now discussing existed long before COVID-19, from an approach to OSHA enforcement that's heavily reliant on voluntary compliance by companies, to an at-will employment regime that limits workers' willingness to speak up, to an embrace by unions and alt-labor groups of single-day strikes that are more about disrupting a company's brand image than disrupting its production. Each of these has taken on new forms as well as new significance during the pandemic. One of the things we don't yet know is how much what's happening now will lead to lasting change in each of them. I know that in so-called normal times, like 3 months ago, we reporters get barraged already with hype about how transformative the latest move by a company or a union is going to be. But right now, we really are seeing workplaces remade in real time, at least temporarily. So there are a lot of important stories to tell, and it's great to get a chance to discuss how we do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Lauren, you have the floor. I think you have to unmute, maybe. Lauren, you have to unmute. Hit the little red microphone on the bottom left.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay,
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me, Steve, and thanks to everyone else at Lyra. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about sort of the 3 phases I think we've gone through so far as someone who covers labor. So back when the pandemic was first starting in early March, I was mostly covering mass layoffs and furloughs and mass hiring that a bunch of companies were doing. So we were seeing loads, thousands of retail workers, service workers, non-essential workers being laid off, and then hundreds of thousands of workers being hired at gig economy companies. So Instacart, for example, had 175,000 gig workers. It's the grocery delivery service company before the pandemic started. Since then, they've hired around more than 500,000 gig workers. Amazon and Whole Foods have hired hundreds of thousands of workers. So that was sort of the first phase. The second phase was adjusting to these new working conditions. So it became very clear that a lot of people weren't receiving like proper protective gear. So they weren't getting face masks or gloves, hand sanitizer. The paid sick leave policies were sort of coming out, and it became clear that a lot of them were very inadequate. Most of paid sick leave policies required that someone receive a positive coronavirus test, which at that time was extremely difficult to come by. And then a lot of places, it became clear that a lot of places weren't going to be offering hazard pay specifically for gig workers. In those weeks, we started to see workers getting sick and dying. This continues to happen. And it became clear that workers their demands were very similar across companies, sort of coalescing around 3 things, which were PPE, personal protective equipment, paid leave, and hazard pay. I think what we've seen in more recent weeks has been an increase in sort of strikes, walkouts, sickouts. big actions that were, a lot of them spontaneous, some of them planned overnight, some of them planned over a course of a week, that have been led by not unions, but grassroots worker organizers, regular employees at Whole Foods, Target, Trader Joe's, Instacart, who have sort of taken it into their own hands to make demands from companies. And I'd like to point out that the people who've led these recent strikes and walkouts, some of them became organizers like just now or over the past few weeks, but a lot of these movements have been building over the past few years. I really think that the people who are leading these sort of non-union worker groups are the face of sort of what we're seeing as like a new labor movement, new and revived labor movement in the United States. Most people are underemployed, they might not have health care, they can't form unions, or they work for companies that are extremely anti-union. So those are the three phases. I think a few things that I've noticed are that, as Josh mentioned, it's really hard to figure out what to cover sometimes. My tip line is just like flooded with people facing, similar situations. So then the question becomes, why and how certain companies should be spotlighted over other ones. Usually we focus on the biggest corporations and then those who are sort of have the most egregious working conditions. Another thing that I already just mentioned was that things happen extremely quickly. Like I said, like strikes and walkouts are literally either spontaneous or they happen overnight. The details change really quickly. So it becomes really important to get, all of the facts straight. Sometimes it's really hard to tell how many people participated in the action. There's a lot of back and forth, I know, between Amazon, where Amazon will be like, oh, 20 people walked out of this warehouse, and the labor group will be like, no, 100 people walked out. And so I think there becomes some sort of, it becomes tricky there on how to cover that, especially because a lot of us aren't going to at least I'm not going to the sites where these actions are taking place. A lot of the actions aren't really taking place anywhere. People are just calling out sick from their homes. People are getting very creative in how they stage these actions because you can't, go, at least for the most part. I know there are some nurses who are doing this and some Amazon warehouse workers, but for the most part, you can't go like stage a strike in real life. The last thing I will say is that typically it's really hard to get workers who are willing to speak on the record and people who are willing to engage in collective actions, and because they're afraid of retaliation. I think we've gotten to a point where things are so dire and people are so concerned not just for their own livelihoods and their jobs, but that of their families and their entire communities. An Amazon warehouse worker who gets exposed to the virus and goes home could expose it to their entire family or their entire neighborhood. A lot of Amazon warehouses are like, the workers are employed by, people in a single town might be, mostly Amazon warehouse workers or Walmart workers. So the things can spread really quickly. It's really a community issue. And so I think that's inspired more people to come forward. They really feel very strongly about this. It's united people across states and countries and different employers. We're even seeing low-level and mid-level managers participate in strikes. Christian Smalls, who led the walkout at Amazon Staten Island warehouse, was actually an assistant manager. I think that's sort of rare. Anyways, I will leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. Noam?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to all the fellow panelists. I'm a huge fan of everybody's work on this panel, and Steve's especially. My thoughts are pretty similar to Josh's and to Lauren's. I might frame it slightly differently. The way I've been thinking about our mandate and how our mandate has changed during the pandemic is, I think a lot of us specialized in a genre of story that I would call the "can you believe it" story, where you would see, a company misclassifying workers, or a company using non-competes or permalancers or mandatory arbitration clauses, and your story would take the form, can you believe the way the company treats its workers using this or that institutional arrangement. And I think, I think we would all agree that those were really important stories to shine a light on, and we considered them pretty central to our mandate as reporters. And I'm sure a lot of us, I know I certainly did, had a lot more of these stories planned before the pandemic descended on us. But obviously now there are more than 30 million people unemployed. A lot of the people who are still working do so, like literally facing the risk of death. And so when you pose these things as, that you previously highlighted as a kind of, can you believe it story, I think the reflex on the part of readers and editors is like, yeah, I can believe it. I can believe much, much worse, actually, given the events of the past 8 weeks. And so I think it does pose a bit of a dilemma for how we think about what to cover. There are still tons, millions of people who've had to sign some terrible non-compete, or they get paid $20,000 a year less than the person in the next cubicle over or next workstation over that does the exact same job, because one is a contractor and one is an employee. But a lot of those people at a time when there's mass unemployment and significant risk of death from a disease may just be happy to have a job. And even if not, maybe our readers are wondering, well, why should we care about this person given the massive risks that hang over everyone now? So it's been a bit of a challenge, and the sort of traditional bread and butter, can you believe it story, I think has required a fair amount of recalibration, as it should, obviously. And I think part of the exercise of the past month and a half or so has been trying to think through exactly how we recalibrate that story. And I think Josh and Lauren both alluded to one of the ways that I've tried to do that, which is, a lot of the issues that we're now seeing flare up have their roots, that long predate the pandemic, and the pandemic has really exacerbated them. I think Steve mentioned some of the stories that Nitasha has done about the difference in treatment for contract workers in Silicon Valley versus employees. So I think one of the ways that we've been able to do that, and I know a lot of the other panelists here have been able to do that, is exactly that, right about the intersection of some of these pre-existing issues and the response on the part of employers and the treatment of employees and workers during the pandemic. But I do worry, even as we're able to do that kind of recalibration and reframing, that we are just missing a ton of stuff, that it's just kind of complete open season when it comes to things like non-competes and misclassification, things that we would have previously been able to shine the light on, that we just don't have the bandwidth, and it's just a really hard sell, both again internally with editors and with readers. And just to take one really prominent example that I've thought of a bit since the pandemic started is, I think all of us have written about the labor issues at Google over the past few years, and they're legion. The use of temps, the organizing against the company, and the alleged retaliation against organizers at the company. On the one hand, these are pretty privileged workers, so no one should cry necessarily that we can't tell their story while we're busy telling other stories. On the other hand, given the power of the tech sector and of Google in particular, I think we all thought that what was going on at that company was a really potentially historically important story. And the idea of writing about, workers organizing against out of control AI at Google, it just feels like it's so far down the priority list at this moment that you'd be hard pressed to do that. So I do worry about all these things that were going on long before, that it may not be easy to draw the connection between those things and the pandemic that were just, that are just nowhere on our radar screen now. Yeah, so I'll leave it there, but very, very keen to chew over the stuff a bit more.
Thanks very much, Noam. Nitasha, your turn.
Hi, everyone. Stephen, thanks for having me, and Lyra, same for putting together this panel. So the other panelists covered, some of the issues that I wanted to talk about, so I'll try to keep it brief. But just to jump on what Noam was saying, I think that there's a real opportunity here to interrogate some of the company narratives that have been so useful in helping these companies kind of evade scrutiny. And, you know, the kind of connection between tech workers and gig workers. As Stephen said, there's too many people covering that. I am one of those people. You know, it's really about concentrating wealth and privilege in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And the narrative for white collar contractors, you know, some of the Google activists that you know, are very willing to speak out now. In recent years, they still believe the company line that, you know, we're only using contract labor for things outside our core competency, like cafeteria work and security, bus drivers. And that's just not true, but I think that the employees believing it actually really helped insulate them. Like some of these narratives are so deep set, you often need industry insiders to like dissent or defect in order to kind of break through. And with gig work, that was obviously the fantasy of flexibility. So I think some of the stories that have been the most successful there are, you know, kind of going into the ways that the app design manipulates them into taking bad jobs and driving more. And just, you know, for a long time, it was really hard to get people to care about that. So this has been a really sudden change. And I also wanted to talk about a couple tactics that the workers use. So with white collar tech workers, you know, I think that they've really kind of used their employers' PR tactics against them, kind of leveraging this disproportionate attention on tech workers and the public interest to organize campaigns that operate sort of like a product launch. You know, they have press releases, sometimes they have PR people, they have a narrative that they want to get across, and they understand that like bad press is often the only way to get these companies to respond. And with gig workers, as Lauren mentioned, you know, a lot of these people are not backed by a union. You know, it's individuals doing this very labor intensive work on their own time. And I think what's so inventive about the way they've gone about it is, you know, there's little small changes that these companies make can make such a profound difference on pay, but there's, you know, no transparency and no consistency. You know, they pay different in different markets, different times, different orders. So they kind of crowdsource receipts and then reverse engineer the impact of these policies and then send that information to the press. So for me, the biggest challenge has been like these companies' total lack of transparency and the difficulty fact-checking their claims, their unwillingness to speak candidly on the record. I've also found it challenging with editors to kind of understand these strategies. You know, they want to know, for example, like how many people are participating in a strike, what impact it's had on a company's business. And, you know, those are fair questions, but those metrics are something that reporters can't really independently verify. Yeah, that's it.
That's great. That's great. So before, there's some very good questions that have come up on chat that I will ask all of you. But before we turn to those questions, do any of you, I invite any of you to comment upon each other's comments. Anyone want to step forward? If not, then, Joel Gershenfeld sends it a question that I was going to ask somewhat of the same thing. Question for any of the panelists: what patterns that you are documenting in this crisis are likely to continue after the pandemic for better or for worse, and what patterns might not continue? You know, worker patterns, or I guess strikes, or how employers are treating workers. Then Michael Hillard asked a question that I'll ask any of you or all of you to respond to. Related question: for reporters on the ground reporting during this crisis, do you see signs that over the next several years, we might see a sustained expansion of the labor movement, especially in worker attitudes about labor and willingness to join or create worker organizations? Or do you think when the crisis passes, worker activism will diminish as well? I invite any of you or all of you to respond. Lauren, Joel, Noam, Nitasha?
Well, Yeah, one thing I think we'll see, and we kind of saw this in Uber's response to the California State AG's lawsuit, AB5 related lawsuit, is they're really going to be stressing that these companies provide ways for people to earn money. That's what they were saying. Maybe also it was in response to their failing stock prices, but I think the ability to earn, it's so urgent right now that could easily overshadow some of the labor concerns that we've had, if Uber or whatever is the only place hiring. And I think that they have successfully, Amazon, Instacart have managed to knock some momentum or some headlines out from the worker concerns with these massive hirings when so many people need a way to provide.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I had a similar thought. I mean, I think going forward, it seems like we're going to emerge from this with certain big winners. Seems obvious. Amazon, e-commerce, delivery are going to be huge growth industries even once people can get out and about. And just the ability of those employers like Amazon and Instacart to hire in the tens or hundreds of thousands at a time when there are millions of people looking for jobs, it does seem to it seems to pose a real challenge for workers trying to build leverage and build power at their workplaces. If you're as an Amazon worker in an Amazon distribution center, and over the past month, Amazon has brought, it's a distribution center of 5,000 people, and over the past month, Amazon has hired another 1,000 or 2,000 people, and maybe 500 people have left. It's just incredibly difficult in an environment with that kind of churn to build any kind of organization, to build any kind of solidarity. And I see this just continuing, in the future, where these companies will be able to, just have their pick from, this unfortunate reserve army of unemployed people. That from the sheer volume of people who are sort of lining up for jobs and the number of people churning in and out of the jobs, it seems very difficult to build some kind of power in these workplaces.
I would agree with all of that. I would also say that I was speaking to one of the lead Instacart organizers the other day who mentioned a similar thing where she said, I have 13, she has a Facebook group with 13,000 Instacart workers, and that's how she organizes most of these strike actions and stuff like that. And in recent weeks, she's seen thousands of people join her group, which is thousands of more people for her to organize. But like you mentioned, like there's 500,000 new workers, it's basically a big setback for her. I do think that a lot of the mass strikes maybe haven't had that huge of a participation. It's hard to gauge like how many Whole Foods workers went on strike last week or Amazon warehouse workers. I think a few places shut down, but I will say that sort of the power of these strikes has been to engage a lot of workers in the sort of at a very disjointed company to, find out that there are these groups that are organizing. Basically every group I spoke to, all of these sort of independent worker groups have seen like a mass influx of interest from people who've never done any labor organizing in their lives. So I think there is sort of it is growing in that way. I don't know if it's growing as quickly as people are hiring.
Thank you. A question from Barbara Dyer. I know that there are occasional feel-good stories about a good employer, but the focus understandably has been to expose egregious actions. However, there is much to learn from those who act responsibly to put workers first. Are they just harder to find? Or is it that the old adage that good news isn't news holds even more in this moment? Josh, maybe you'd want to comment because you work for Bloomberg? Or any of you?
I'll just say this. All of us, I'm sure, are leery of overstating the bad news and you know, having too cynical an interpretation of every action that an employer takes. But, you know, it's so hard. You know, in any environment, you're always looking for the fine print or for, you know, the employer that has its fingers crossed behind its back. But in a world like this where things are changing so quickly, and I think as Lauren said, like or Nitasha might have said, it's so hard to get any transparency into these decisions. Like you're just so leery of sticking your neck out there and trumpeting some seemingly positive development, only to discover that like a week later, this employer has like exposed thousands of workers to corona and, you know, laid off its entire workforce, or not. You know, maybe in some cases it's better for them to be laid off because they had at least qualified for enhanced unemployment benefits and get to stay home. But they've chosen not to do that, and it's actually worse for the employee. So I think we're all so concerned about the quickness with which seemingly good news can kind of turn sour, that it, you know, I personally at least am pretty gun shy about these things.
Yeah, I think there's a couple examples of that recently, at least that I've been not really weighing in covering, but I do appreciate that people might say this is good news and why aren't people covering it. There's this company called Carta that had a very generous policy for employees that it was laying off, and the CEO had this like Medium post that was very candid and took full blame, and Airbnb did a massive layoffs yesterday, time goes weirdly, but they used a lot of the same things, and it sounds very generous, but again, like Noam was saying, like how can I you know, not only verify that the employees who are laid off are getting these benefits, you know, sometimes it takes some time to see that. But for example, Airbnb said, you know, we're going to give you, we're going to pay for COBRA through the end of 2020. And the reason we're doing COBRA is because the plans don't extend. Is that true? Like, you know, like how can I verify that? And I just, you know, there's all these little things that make, that could make good news, especially when it comes from the company and they're doing it to promote themselves, just misleading.
Thank you. So a question from Mark David Guff. A question for anyone. What role, if any, can academics play in helping reporters bring contemporary labor issues to a broader audience? The academics attending today are experts and publish frequently on labor issues being discussed, but we mainly talk among our own small circles. What can we do, if anything, to help you bring attention to these circles to the general public? I think today's webinar is helping journalists learn about academics and vice versa. And hopefully this will lead to happy matrimony. Anyone want to answer a question about, you know, what role can academics play in helping reporters?
Sure. I'm always eager to hear from academics. Obviously, academics have their own workplace issues that we're interested in talking about, but academics are also a terrific source of tips sometimes about things that they're hearing in conversations with companies, with organizers, and others that may not have been reported. Also, academics bring tremendous perspective and understanding, for example, the history of something that's going on, the broader significance. All the time we go to people and say, we've obtained this contract that this company made someone sign. Is it unusual? And is that a story, or is it totally normal? And maybe that's the story. It's been very useful to me recently to be able to talk to historians about this moment and these questions we're wrestling with, like for labor to have an upsurge, do you need the best possible economic conditions or the worst possible economic conditions, or some of each to be happening at once? And I think editors and readers appreciate the broader perspective that academics are often able to bring in to ensure that we are not having blinders on, either based on who we're talking to or based on the particular historic moment that we're talking in. And I especially appreciate academics who are willing to go through the exercise of repeating what they said in a more concise sentence that we will be able to put into print.
Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I've actually found it extremely useful in a covering labor context to talk to historians and academics. I think they have been the ones responsible for, kind of offering the necessary context to understand that Uber didn't invent these labor practices, or like, even back in the 1930s, companies were telling you, it's just a small group of disgruntled people, which you hear in response to every labor strike. And I think also for me, it helps the sense of tech exceptionalism, like this is all unprecedented, how could they do it, by putting it in that context. And when they have done their own independent research, that's like on some of those things, I mean, I so welcome any feedback or expertise.
Okay, here's a question that I'm often asked. I'm sure, Josh, Lauren, Noam, Nitasha, you're often asked a similar question. So this is from Emily. I represent a newly unionized unit at a UAW local that mostly represents academic workers. This unit, counselors and medical staff from Student Health Services, just unionized, bargaining first contract. 80% of the workers are just furloughed. My question is, what elements in this narrative would create interest on the part of journalists? We are currently getting signatures on a letter starting Facebook page, ULPs. Whom should we contact to help us get our story? Let me just, I'll add one line in a non-moderator role. All of these journalists are, I can assure you, are hugely overworked. They have 5 times as many stories, good stories to write about, that they have time to do. And oftentimes a story like a newly unionized local will get emails from 20 different newly unionized locals saying, please write about us. And the reporters here are mainly national media. And for many stories, I say you should really focus on your local media, where they might see you as a local story and they might more readily write about you than Bloomberg or the Washington Post or the New York Times. Anyway, I invite any of you to answer Emily's question.
Can I add, this is a major university in New York City, and they seem to be definitely targeting this group. There are other unions in the university, but they are already unionized and have contracts. And this unit, I'm leading the negotiations, are trying to bargain their first contract. So it's particularly troublesome.
It starts with the letter C, right? Anyway, what do I know? So.
No, it starts with the letter N.
N, okay, sorry. Okay.
There's 2 words. Can I say the school? Is that kosher? I don't know. Maybe not.
It's up to you. Nothing is off the record here, but it's up to you.
Well, it's all of this is happening. So it is the new school in New York City. Okay. And as far as we know, no other health services in universities and colleges in the city have been furloughing their workers. So,
anyone want to answer?
I can jump in. I think, at the highest altitude, there are usually, I can think of immediately off the top of my head 2 criteria that will probably get most, the attention of most of the people on the panel. One is something that you may have going for you, which is some tension between the sort of public image of the employer or the institution and the practices that they appear to be engaging in on the ground. So that can definitely get our attention, and it's something that we can sell internally. And 2 is, typically there has to be something conceptually new. If it's sort of another iteration of something that seems pretty familiar, even if it's in a new a new context, it's hard to storyfy that and hard to sell that internally into readers. But if it feels conceptually new, it's a new class of worker, or it's a new it's a new approach. Just to give one example, I think I covered this. Some of you might have too. There was a lawsuit filed by workers at a Smithfield pork processing plant in Missouri a week or 2 ago, And some of the issues were pretty familiar. People were concerned about social distancing and a possible COVID outbreak at a plant where workers stand really close together. But the complaint had an interesting wrinkle, which was they were arguing that the plant presented a public nuisance under Missouri's public nuisance law, which is a law that dates back, the common law doctrine, some of the academics can correct me if I'm wrong, but dates back hundreds of years. And so bringing these claims under a public nuisance doctrine was interesting and new and potentially important going forward if other people were to pick up that argument. And so that transformed a story that seemed a little bit familiar. There's a lot of workers at meatpacking plants that look like they're at risk of getting infected. And that story has been written a lot, and it added this sort of conceptually new dimension that sort of vaulted it into a higher priority for us.
I would echo everything Noam said. We are often looking for things that are in some way conceptually counterintuitive or surprising. And of course, sometimes the story is hiding in plain sight and that something is taken for granted among labor and employment practitioners and activists, but surprising to a broader audience. Sometimes it's something that nobody knew about until it was exposed. It's easier, speaking as a Bloomberg reporter, to write about large, well-known institutions or where there's a connection to a large, well-known institution. It's easier to write about things when we can identify a trend that is real, where there is something that is new, and often there's a tension between newness and trendiness, because if it's so new, how can you say it'll be a trend? And at Bloomberg, as I'm sure for all my colleagues here, it's very helpful to have an exclusive. Most of the stories I get to do, I have to have something that hasn't been reported before. And sometimes organizations, for other reasons, dribble out information in press releases that they send in what seems like a scattershot way, or tweets that can then make it harder for a number of national reporters to write about something because no one feels like they were able to be first to it. And so it's a strategy to consider. And I will share my email now with everyone.
So this is from Matt Pierce of the LA Times. What are your philosophies on granting anonymity to workers and management on a story? On the record attribution is always the gold standard, but management usually has much more power to speak publicly compared to workers, especially in the non-union workplaces you might report on. Lauren, you've been interviewing a lot of low-wage workers who are really sticking their necks out in some of these strikes and walkouts. Can you start with an answer to Matt's question?
Yeah, so I think that at Vice we're allowed to use anonymous sources, but we have to prove and provide a reason that, or prove that they have a serious risk by coming out and using their name. That could be retaliation, obviously, is the most common one, or they might not get future work. It might be a super sensitive story where they could be harmed there could be threats of physical violence for coming out and sharing the story, future employment. So I think usually if any of those things are true, we tend to grant people anonymity pretty easily. I know that I imagine at the New York Times and the Washington Post, it maybe takes more than that. But typically, anytime someone faces a serious threat, we're willing to grant them anonymity, and we just go through our own process of verifying their employment and verifying the details of their story, and making sure that those don't get out in the story. A lot of times, if something is super specific that happened, we'll sort of have to obfuscate the details to make sure that that person's identity doesn't come out, or someone who leaked something, their identity doesn't come out in the process of telling the story.
Anyone else want to add, or should we go to the next question? Okay, Professor Rose Batt at Cornell has her hand up. Rose, What is your comment or question, and hoping all is well in Ithaca? Rose?
I didn't know I still had my hand up. That was from a while ago. But I do want to just say that in this period, and in some ways, not everyone, but academics have a little less on their plate because a lot of their administrative meetings and et cetera, are canceled. That I've noticed, at least at ILR, a number of people are writing their own op-eds and learning that craft. And so when we talk about what we can do for journalists, I think that's really important. I also think we've talked about this over the years, that it behooves us to also learn how to write op-eds. And it really isn't that hard. I mean, I think once you kind of get the formula and you get a good hit or good anchor, that I've at least been able to place op-eds. I think The Hill has been very receptive. And some people, like Adam Litwin, who had written about the terrible cleanliness conditions of hospitals when they outsourced cleaning. And that's an article he wrote. He did a lot of research a few years ago. He was able to bring that back and make it contemporary, and The Hill just published it this week. So I think we could look into ourselves and say, where do we have some unique research that we really could get out there and try to do op-eds and then learn from other people. I know Steve came last year and gave us a wonderful talk about how to begin to think along those lines. So I really think we should all try to do that.
And since all four of you reporters don't have any opinions because you're neutral, unbiased reporters, you can't comment upon op-eds, right? Rose, that's a great idea about getting op-eds out. It's not as easy as many people think. And I always tell people, keep it short, keep it lively, keep it to one subject. And a lot of people have problems doing all three of those things. A question, from Matthew Capisi of the Carpenters Union. As you've been exposing, the butcher's bill has come due for decades of sins, from the mechanical to the mortal: antiquated unemployment division computers and lack of staffing, growing misclassification, income inequality, lack of access to meaningful health care, hostility towards union organizing, and much, much more. Do you see any long-term positive change that won't just fade when the dust has settled? Do you see any long-term positive change coming from this crisis? I invite any of you to respond.
Maybe. I think we don't know. One of the things that's been interesting to see, to Noam's point about the "can you believe it" story, is the targeted temporary measures that we've been seeing in some areas. So for example, in New York City, legislation to try to address, should it really be the case that healthcare workers can be fired for making comments exposing workplace issues? Or in Congress, this very narrow sort of paid leave that is now the law if you're lucky enough or not to work at one of the select companies that it applies to. And it naturally raises the question of, fill in the blank. If nobody should be fired for speaking up about safety during the coronavirus while working in a hospital, why does the same not apply in the same way to any number of other situations? And similarly for paid leave, and similarly for the minimum pay issues that are being raised in conjunction with the coronavirus. That said, all kinds of things happen where we look and we say, well, things will never be the same after this. And then years later, we look back and say, oh, remember how that seemed like such a big deal at the time? And so I think we don't know. And in many ways, we are right now in a best and worst time for all sorts of collective action by workers, where the fear of retaliation for some people is being overcome by the fears of the pandemic. And on the other hand, as others have said, there is this tremendous additional set of fears about the labor market that we're in and all the other obstacles to what we think of traditionally as activism. And so we will have to see.
I think that, like Josh said, it's hard to know exactly what will happen, or impossible to know that, but I am really interested in the misclassification just in terms of potential lawsuits, or, when you see the arguments in court that were used against Uber and Lyft, say in the lawsuits, to prove that they were workers. I mean, a lot of maybe the bonuses, or they haven't made significant change. It's been really like they give as little as they can possibly give. However, the language that they're using about their workers, the way they're interacting with them, maybe that could all be used to strengthen misclassification lawsuits. The other thing about hostility to unions, I could see that potentially changing. I mean, that has been, but frankly, I do see a bias towards like newly formed unions. I mean, there's just been so much, like that's a narrative that has also been really hard to disrupt, in the tech industry, at least. The idea of, tech companies will tell you on background, like, they're working with an outside organization, like that's supposed to be a knock against organizing, that they would go to someone else. And I can see, as unions win protections for workers, maybe potentially mitigating layoffs or something like that, it maybe the hostility might shift a bit.
Okay, questions on coverage. This is from Christopher Martin, who actually literally wrote a book about coverage of working class issues and how it's diminished over the decades. Christopher says, Stephen mentioned a list of many excellent labor reporters. How do you think other reporters not on a workplace beat have been doing? Many new organizations have no workplace reporters. Has the pivot worked well, or has it been difficult for them to tell these stories without the experience and sources? And I want to add a second question from Wilma Liebman, former head of the NLRB. Wilma asks, what will be the next phase of coverage after the worker strikes activism? More strikes perhaps in response to back to work orders, and will editors sustain the interest in covering worker stories? One New York Times reporter, not Noam, recently said to me, Wilma, journalists are fickle and it's not clear the interest in these issues will continue. So I invite any of you to answer the questions from Chris Martin and Wilma.
I would say I think there's been a bunch of terrific reporting about workplaces by people who have before had other beats. And so-called labor journalists, we can't run around and on the one hand say, work, the thing that we cover, the work that we do is essential to every other part of life, and you can't understand any aspect of the world without looking into labor, and at the same time say, but only labor journalists can do it. There's a contradiction there. So I think it's great that many more people in this moment are looking at work in the broad sense in different ways, and it's led to a bunch of terrific coverage. And for all of us, whatever we were covering before, the way that things are moving quickly and the situation force challenges in terms of assessing critically whether things that seem new really are that new, and whether something has happened before or is happening elsewhere that would help put something particular that someone's reached out about in a better context for readers.
I just want to add, go on.
I was just going to say that at Vice, on my team, which is the tech desk motherboard, we have a couple people who cover labor, but at this point, over the past few months, everyone has done a labor story, and it's not because they ran out of stories necessarily or didn't have anything else to do. It's that their beats started intersecting with labor stories. We have a transportation reporter who is covering, bus drivers and different types of transportation jobs. We have cybersecurity reporters who are also, having an intersection with labor. And I think they've all done a really good job. I do think it is difficult for people who've never covered labor before, maybe to, maybe more than it is for someone who's constantly covering labor stories. But I think that, like Josh was saying, there is a lot of opportunity for other reporters. I mean, labor intersects with everything. So I think people have done a really good job overall.
I agree with Josh and Lauren. I'm going to weigh in here. I think there are some non-labor reporters who've done amazingly good stories about bus drivers or healthcare workers or delivery workers. I mean, just amazing stuff. And a really good reporter knows how to talk to people and tell their story very, very well. So we have it's 4 minutes till the end of the hour. So I invite each of you to give closing remarks for a minute. And again, I thank all of you for doing such a wonderful job. We'll start again with you, Josh.
I would just say first that as there's been more attention in this moment to alt labor, to worker center and other groups that are not traditionally understood unions and are organizing workers, people ask questions about whether this is the solution to everything that's ailed organized labor. And that's a question that people have been asking for as long as I've been writing about these groups and for much longer. And I think it's important to keep in mind that in many cases, companies don't just fight organizing because they're afraid of it turning into a union. They also fight unions because they don't want organizing. And so workers who try in informal or alternative ways to take collective action and force changes in the workplace come up on some of the same types of headwinds and resistance that more traditional union activists have. And in this moment, at a place like Amazon, it's interesting how we see both labor unions with capital letters like SCIU and UFCW, and also groups like Make the Road or the Council on American Islamic Relations involved and working to various extents together to try to tackle this difficult thing. The last thing I would say is please reach out to me and please bring me your stories. And thanks again to everyone.
Lauren?
Yeah, I guess I would just note that I think in the coming months, there are going to be a lot more, I mean, I know that we've talked about not paying so much attention to tech, but I think Instacart's in-store shopper employees are really going to start, trying to unionize. I think that, Kickstarter just unionized. They're the first, tech company to have a big union, and I think they're just starting contract negotiations, and that could really set off a wave of more union organizing, and in these places that have had a lot of organizing going on but not traditional union organizing. So I'm definitely keeping an eye on those things, yeah, that's it. Thanks so much for having me, and I added my email to the chat as well.
Noam? Microphone.
Yeah. So Josh alluded to this earlier, but it's the question of the kind of cyclical dimension of organizing, and all of us have probably touched on this in our reporting and our writing in the past few years. But typically, you see typically organizing tends to increase as the economy improves and the labor market tightens. And so as the bottom falls out of the economy and there's massive unemployment, your sort of initial prior on what would happen would be that it gets harder to organize. Obviously, the huge exception to that, is a lot of the historians will probably affirm, is the Great Depression. So I think it's if the labor market softens and things get bad, it's harder to organize. But if it really, really, really gets bad, then it gets easier to organize. And so the question, I think, going forward is it going to just get bad and make it harder to organize, or is it going to get really, really, really bad and in that way sort of be galvanizing to millions of workers? And so that's very difficult to know in real time how that shakes out. But obviously, that's something that we'll be paying close attention to over the course of the next year or so.
So Noam, you're saying, do we want 10% unemployment or 30%?
Right, exactly. And if it's the latter, then clearly we're going to see some organizing on a mass scale.
Nitasha.
Well, thank you again for having me on this panel. I love the work of the other reporters and Stephen. I think it will be really interesting to see how companies are going to change their retaliatory tactics and their, their kind of the narratives that I spoke about at the beginning of the panel, because the changes that they've been making, at least for the workers that I cover, are so small and temporary. So, you know, Amazon, for instance, initially just was going to put the $2 extra through April, and then they waited until late in April to put it through May 16th. And, you know, it very much looks like this is going to last for a very long time. So some of those early kind of throwaways that they gave, I'm just very curious to see where that will go. And I will agree with whoever said journalists are fickle. We are, but they're, for me, you know, having to sell these stories internally, I've had more interest than I've had in the past. So, you know, you can please reach out to me if you have a story that you want covered and you know, need to think about ways to frame it that will work. Thanks, everyone.
I thank all of you. I've been getting all these private messages saying what a wonderful foursome, what a wonderful quartet the four of you have been. And it's been really a great hour. And I thank all of you. And I thank Emily Smith and Joel for helping me out. And let's all thank Lyra for sponsoring such a edifying, educational, hopefully interesting hour. And I guess we can sign off. I should add, Lyra has a series of other really good webinars on labor issues every Thursday, and you should check out their website. Many of them are very worthwhile. And everyone stay healthy, stay safe, and stay sane.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.